not only synchronized as a good pair, but avoiding the confusion that comes when they get tired and that sort of thing. We do not find that you need a lot of lens power. And so it's not a matter of just hanging a pair of glasses on you and solving your problem. In fact, I would be hesitant to start out with just a pair of glasses. We have some alternatives. The first one, of course, is to go on having the same trouble you're having. Second one is to do something with lenses that you wear just at close work to see what would happen. And the third alternative, which I would be more comfortable suggesting to you, would be both lenses and some training to get those eyes working like they used to. You understand what I mean by that, don't you? Mm-hmm. Because it was pretty obvious from what you told me that the fatigue level you're having is much higher than you wish it would work to be.
Oh, yeah.
And so to get the skill and get the freedom and get the flexibility that'll let you do your work more easily, really to be sure that we're going to give you some help, we're going to have to do both some training to get some basic skills reestablished and then some lenses to maintain the skills we accomplish. And so we've got three alternatives. Nothing, lenses and hope, or lenses and training, and get a job done. And that's where it stands.
Okay.
All right? And so we'll set an appointment for training program, and then as soon as we can, we'll get lenses on you that will begin to help you at work. Now, I don't know how soon that'll be. We'll start training through lenses so that we start getting some flexibility as quickly as possible. Then we'll prescribe lenses that you use for all work purposes. And so we'll start there. Okay?
Okay.
May I interject?
I believe that one of the most important aspects of your entire optometric performance in an office is the history and the communication you establish with the patient right off the bat. I hope that our conversation illustrated to you that it can be a very cordial and very informative sort of thing both ways. And you find your own way to do it. You find what's comfortable. But you will find ways to use the history to express your interest in what the patient is experiencing. Now, maybe that's even more important than the history they give you, the details they give you. But when they realize out of your kind of questions and the little bit of repartee and so on that goes on, that you do care about their particular problem, then it makes it a whole lot better from there on. And so as far as I'm concerned, the history is tremendously important. Now, I called your attention to it. And you heard, I hope I was able to demonstrate, the way I try to draw out from them what information they have for me. And all the way through on this, I made a strong effort not to give Roseanne a leading question. Now, there are times when I had to. But I tried to use an open-end question so that she didn't know quite what I was probing for. Now, particularly in the analytical. I didn't say, now tell me when it blurs, tell me when you see two, now tell me when it's one again. Because there are many patients who want to be good patients, will give you what they think you ought to hear, regardless of whether it's happening or not. And so you keep posing the question, what's happening? Does it look different? And you're more likely to get it. Now, sometimes it's difficult, and sometimes you have to go back and probe. Sometimes you have to give them a question, a leading question. But I will not do that until all other things have disappeared. Because what I want to know is what they're seeing, not what they think I want them to see. And so I tried that in the history. Now, I felt that Roseanne gave us information right off the bat. Not only why she was seeking help, I didn't have to say, why are you in my office? She was telling me why she was in my office at the moment. She reads a lot, writes on a computer 3 to 4 hours a day, and she would rather interview people. What does that tell you right off the bat? You know, she's no different than me and thee. We like best what's easiest. And so when someone tells me, and we've got some more handouts for the youngsters' queries and some of that stuff. I guess you have them anyway. The information that they give us about what they like to do best frequently tells us what they do easiest.
It could also be a retreat from the task.
Right.
An escape.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. And so she likes best to interview talking to people. Well, now we can go back to the fourth circle in communication and all the rest of it. Would there be less visual stress in communicating to people, with people, than there is working on a computer? So which way does she get least tired? And so on. Right off the bat, we get that. What part of your work do you wish you could avoid? I think this is one of the most important questions you can ask. Because she said, proofreading, is what fatigues her the most, where she feels the least efficient, where she feels the most difficulty, where eventually eyes begin to hurt. Proofing is tiring, my efficiency goes down, I get slower, and I make more errors. Now, boy, you can pick up on that one in a hurry. We were interested in the break that she commented that she would read 2 hours a day in spite of the fatigue on proofing. And so I asked her particularly what she reads, and if you'll read it, look at it carefully, at her intellectual level, she is not reading the classics and a magazine with the same intensity, the same cognitive demand that she's reading the computer. I was saying to Jim and Dale that we have a series of color slides which show these reading levels. I mentioned them this morning, the reading levels a la Betts and his work in many years, and what the retinoscope shows you on these different levels of reading. And I would, if we could set it up and do it like we did in exploration over the years, I'm quite sure that we'd find an entirely different retinoscopic reflex on the classics than there is on the computer or proofreading hard material, hard proof. And so right away we begin to get some clue that reading itself, the near-point task itself, is not necessarily the whole problem. You follow what I'm saying? The problem is restrained, constrained demand for comprehension.
Over time.
Over time. And so, because if it was strictly just a near-point test, she would not be reading 2 hours for relaxation, because that's pretty near point too. And so we're back to what we were saying this morning about the difference in what you're doing. I was amazed. She only watches 1 hour of television. She's a very unique individual. I don't think there's many people around that only watch 1 hour of television a week. Most people are addicted to 5 or 6 hours a night. But she's smart enough to choose her programs well. Her favorite outdoor activity was all distance activity. She had no hobbies, no near-point tasks that demand high discrimination. What would she be like? Let me ask it another question. Do you think she'd be a stamp collector? You get my question? How about what would she do on cross-stitching?
Needlepoint.
Needlepoint? See? Well, if she said, I said, do you have a hobby? And she said, no. I asked her, do you have a hobby? And she said, no. Roseanne, are we right? She'll admit she only reads an hour a day. The truth will out, Roseanne. All right. What's she best at outdoors? Volleyball. Now, if you look at that a little bit, but she'd like to be better because what did she say? Most interesting comment of all she made as far as I'm concerned. What did she say wasn't as good as it ought to be at volleyball? Keeping the whole court in view. What does it say about peripherality? Orientation? A few things like that?
Where am I? Where is it?
Well, that's right. That's right. And especially when you have to move quickly. Now we begin to look at some other things immediately. If she's having trouble in movement, as on volleyball, keeping the whole court organized and oriented, what would you expect motilities to be? Do you hear my question? What do motilities demand? And especially now, just a minute, there is so much difference between her following my moving target and her moving her eyes on the world. These are two entirely different tasks. We learned a long time ago and worked a long time ago over this question about, well, does following a moving target cure a reading problem? Well, I'm saying it to save time, because most of us didn't cure reading problems with motility. But we realized that there's a tremendous difference in following a flying dishpan, a squint corrector, a rotating target, a rotating disc, or a swinging ball, and moving your eyes with control in a scan action across a line of print. They're two entirely different kinds of signals. And so if she was having trouble moving eyes on a moving target that she could look at, what do you expect her to have when she's out there in the world where she has to take a lot of quick looks, quick glances, to be sure of all the information that you have to get out of that kind of an ocular inspection, that kind of a scan?
I watched this very
Carefully. I can remember when we were all told that if they saw the cylinder on far retinoscope, it was always there, and you didn't have to pay any attention to it because it was always going to be there. I can remember in my college days that because this was beat into us, we were told that we dare not quit with a patient. We dare not bring him out of the examining booth until all findings, 4, 5, and 7, were all the same cylinder. Well, it didn't take us long to find out how to make it the same cylinder for everybody so that we'd get out of that booth in a little while. I'm very curious about the change in the cylindrical element, the meridional differences between far and near. And if there is less meridional difference on near retinoscope than there is on far retinoscope, from then on I will do the best I can to ignore it. And that's why I did not chase the cylinder on subjective. There's another reason. With this particular patient and some of her difficulty with discrete discrimination, I'm quite sure that if I'd used the cross cylinder and a clock dial over here, we could have played games on the amount of cylinder just as long as we wanted to chase it, and could have ended up with a half 75 or a diopter at axis 12.5 or 17.5 or 92.5. Greg, get a microphone.
Just a minute, Greg.
I've always been amazed at how much information that you get from an analytical net. Could you give us, just without getting into a long digression, how you'd interpret differently if the cylindrical finding is different near and far? For instance, if it's more at near than at far?
Yes.
And all the various combinations, how you'd interpret that?
Well,
particularly if it's
I
more
wish
at
we
near
had
than
2
far.
days to do this whole job here, 3 or 4. I'll give it to you as quickly as I can. And this is held not in just my office, but with enough people so that we have some confidence in it. Skeff always said, if 3 people find the same thing, 3 different places, 3 different times, it has some validity when there's no collusion. When you have, with the rule, astigmatism, in quotation marks, minus cylinder axis 180, and you have less of that cylinder on near retinoscope than you do on far, you do the very best you can to avoid prescribing it. Because we found over the years that half 75 amount of cylinder would disappear through the judicious use of plus lenses.
What else was found when they did prescribe it?
I'll get to that.
Okay.
No, right now, I was thinking somewhere else. What happens when they did prescribe it? They soak it up and need more.
They became progressive.
Have you ever had
astigmates.
progressive astigmates? If you haven't, it's because you haven't watched the same patient long enough.
Harold Lutz started out in optometry college at about a -50 and ended up 3 1/4.
That's right.
They should have
Because the
used
more you
theory.
put on, the more they soak up. And that is typical of it. And there's a good reason for it. We go back to the 4 circles. When you start disturbing the vertical and horizontal meridians of visual space, do you do that with a cylinder? A cylindrical lens have any influence on vertical and horizontal meridians of visual space? Sooner or later, the patient has to adapt to it. Now they need more cylinder. And it's very similar to minus lens in the soaking it up. And so they will get progressively more astigmatic. Now, minus axis 180. When there is more meridional difference at near than there is at far, you may have to prescribe some of it, but you work like the dickens to not give it any that you can avoid in prescription and get into training as soon as you can. Pardon? Yes. Yes, still 180. But more cylinder at near than at far. More cylinder on 5 than on 4. Then if you may have to prescribe some, but you do as little as possible.
It's like the ad on TV for the stock market company. They do it the old-fashioned way. They have to earn it.
Yeah.
They have to earn that cylinder. You measure a 1 1/4, they have to earn it. If a half won't give them the acuity and 75 will, you don't put the 1 1/4 on. They have to earn it.
My father taught me that the patient earns the cylinder they get, meaning that they have to convince you in your conversation with them on a subjective that, yes, that looks more natural and feels better, not just see it clearer. That's what we mean by earning it. Now, minus cylinder axis 90, entirely different bag. And I wish we had time to play with meridial differences and the postural influence and the spatial influence, because there's a good concept here that has been pretty well validated by not just us in optometry, Harmon's work, a number of people in stress. Minus cylinder axis 90 is basically an orientation problem, where minus cylinder axis 180 is basically an identification problem. Do I need to say that again? Minus cylinder axis 180, and now we're talking about a 1 1/4 or less, because the minute you get to 2 diopters, you've got a different bag. We're talking 1 or 1 1/4 diopters or less. Minus cylinder axis 180 is primarily an identification problem, not accommodative, identification. How do we judge this? How do we assume this? On the basis that when you put a simple plus lens on, the cylinder disappears. And what does the simple plus lens have its most effect on? Identification. Most effect. It also influences centering, but its primary effect is on identification. You will find when you get there, as I have, that senility and vertical cylinder, or cylinder at minus axis 90, goes hand in hand. Now you've known that, your literature has told you that, and if you've watched older patients, you've seen them go from axis 180 to axis 90 as they progress through time. The major problem with senility is orientation. And orientation then goes with minus cylinder axis 90, and minus cylinder axis 90 has an orientation reference.
Orientation problem.
Well, how many myopes are there in the room? That's why they don't wear their plus lenses.
Okay. Maybe they're wearing plus over the top of that.
I hope so. How confident are you in space? How confident are you in spatial judgments? Very? Very. I'd sure like to test you. Because I find most myopes, there's always exceptions. Skeff's way out was characteristically. The myope gives up an awful lot of spatial orientation. And you know what they give up first of all? Periphery. Periphery. And this is one reason the myope with new contact lenses, oh my gosh, the world looks so real, because you've given back periphery. And all the evidence that I can look at that fits my bias, and so I like it. You know, we always choose the evidence we want to agree with us, is that one of the very first things the myope begins to lose is periphery, and the more periphery we lose, the more orientation we lose. You can play with it. And so minus cylinder axis 90, when there is more cylinder at far, less cylinder at near, you make them earn every nickel's worth. When there's more cylinder at near than there is at far, you better prescribe both to a discrimination and a comfort level. But if you really want to give them help, you insist on some training and orientation. I have a feeling, and it's just a gut feeling, that one of the benefits, one of the things that has happened in orthokeratology is the fact that it has changed peripheral central relationships more than it's changed the slope of the cornea. And it's the change in the central peripheral relationships that then changes the slope of the cornea, not the pressure on it. Because I know you can change the slope of the cornea, the keratometer finding, as you manipulate central peripheral relationships. And so and Bob, yes, I'm seeing too many kids showing minus axis 90. And almost every one of those youngsters has all kinds of spatial problems. They don't even know how to get home from school because they ride a bus. They have all kinds of spatial unorganization, not disorganization, because they never had it to begin with. And if I were in that kind of a problem and had to organize my four circles, my systems that all belong to the visual system, I'd want to be very sure of bilaterality that gives me a good horizontal world so that I don't have to pull it in working on it like you do in book retinoscope, which then would measure as minus cylinder axis 90. You follow the optics I've just given you? So I see this minus cylinder or plus cylinder or whatever you're playing with on the basis of an orientation, centering, identification process. And when I see less cylinder at near, and I watch it very carefully, and on Roseanne, the minute I looked in that left eye, right eye, whichever it was.
Right had the quarter.
Right eye had the quarter. Even a quarter was much too much. And so I could take it out on number 5. And as a result, then, I'm not going to chase it on subjective. There is no doubt in my mind that if I had put a quarter cylinder on her on my subjective, I might have got another row clarity. But I'm sure it would have been the minus effect, the reduced plus effect, rather than just the cylinder.
Minus cylinder axis 90 related to old age. I won't use the word senility. As people get older, what kinds of things then can we give those older people to do so that that's not going to develop? Because they're going after identification, giving up orientation. If
you want to offer benefits, then one of the very best things for us old folks is called square dancing. Now, have you used square dancing as a visual training procedure? Think about it a moment.
Alamein right. You don't know what
and
is.
Keeping track of 7 other people. You make a mistake and it's a social confrontation they won't let you forget.
Get there at the right time, not the wrong time.
Timing, all kinds of things. Now, I'm being facetious, but do you understand what I'm saying? All right, what do we know? Ed Kasprick in Chicago went out to old folks, to nursing homes, and did some of this. He literally did some of this with not just square dancing, he took out his walking rail. He did all kinds of things like that, especially on orientation. And his report was, most of my patients came alive again. What does that say? We got so much we could talk about here. What I said was that yoke prisms is the real way to build orientation. Why? What did Harmon and what did Skeffington and then Harmon show us about this anti-gravity system? That it's a basic postural organization, right? Am I right? You know, these space cadets, these astronauts, you know what they did the most training on? The most training of all was how to defeat no gravity. And they had to learn how to move themselves without gravity. It was a postural organization. And in the sheet of paper you've got, I tried to identify the anti-gravity process as terribly important to this whole organization of bilaterality. God made us very beautifully as a two-sided animal that has to have all kinds of bilateral alternation in it. Otherwise, we'll be rabbits all our lives. And so that horizontalness is the unity of these architectural halves. And that's the basis of orientation. Show me a youngster, a CP kid, or a youngster without some of these processes, or an adult without some of these processes, and they feel their way through the world and they got 20/20. Because they have to depend on some other system for orientation. But the system they depend on is this total bilaterality. And as Skeff said it, and as Renshaw said it when he found out what he was talking about, and what Harmon said over all the years, that binocularity in the total system precedes binocularity in the visual system.
Because
I want to spend time on inductions, and particularly as they relate to Roseanne, because I think we've got some very interesting information here. Let's look first of all at her number, or her far point ductions. What did Scaffold say? The ductions were 4. These were ranges to withstand stress. And I've tried to look at that. What does he mean by such a statement? Let's look at 3 aspects of ductions, divergences. Visual abilities to cope with the stress is appraised by the Skeffington syndrome. The 3 ranges of visual ability probed with base out or base in prism are: blur range probes the patient's ability to cope with stress which distorts identification and comprehension. Let me say it again. The blur finding is our probe of the range of identification and comprehension. It's not a muscle test at all. The break range probes the patient's ability to cope with stress which disrupts centering and orientation. Now, if you want to look at the optics of it, please do. What are you doing optically when you put in prism base out or base in? The target is stationary. The target does not move. But you're introducing a probe, a prism, which acts as if that target was moving. And so it's an interpretive finding right from scratch. Not just break, the whole bit. Recovery range probes the patient's ability to reestablish centering and identification stress is reduced. And if we're alert enough, we will ask the patient, as when they get recovery, is it clear now? Because it gives us some idea of how much recovery they've got. More often than not, when they do recover, it's still blurry. Pardon? All right. Good. It's there in the stuff you've got. All right, now let's look at these a little bit differently, because I am convinced of something. See, again, I'm giving you my own bias. That's why I love your fights and your arguments and your disagreements. There is no way that we can take a prism base out and not take a prism base in if we're going to explore these ranges we're talking about. Because it's a total range around the plane of regard that we're looking for. And so the recover, let's start at the blur range. These are near expecteds. Look at these three ranges. I think it's very interesting that they extend almost equidistant on each side of the plane of regard when we have what we call our expecteds. Now, are you thinking, I hope you're thinking out there in space instead of convergence, divergence. The range of blur, the range of break on each side of the plane of regard, not just one way or the other. This is why it upsets me when I find that people do a prism base out to check on exophoria. What I want to know is what's the base out compared to the base in on that particular test. And so I want to look at the ranges all the way. Now let's look at it another way. Let's look at it on the basis of Roseanne. Here's Roseanne over here. I've got them when we were off the chart for a moment, off the screen. Now, give me her findings, please. What was her blur range? What was the blur on number 9? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And did you catch her report that it was blurring on number 11? Did you get that? What was that? 4. Okay. Her blur range is pretty much in the expected at the moment. At the moment. What was her break range on 10 and 11? Break on 10 was what? 20. Break on 11. Now, if you know, we're working here on 19 and 9, so let's, right about here is the middle of her range instead of like it is here. And so what does that range tell you? Which way does she move easiest?
In.
It tells me something else. It tells me that when that visual range has moved in, it's not going to match up with her tactual range. You follow what I'm saying? What's a tactual range? What's the manual information? What's the most important of all orientation devices in the human being? What's the one we rely on most to find out where something is?
Finger.
Now, if my hand tells me it's here and my visual system tells me it's in here, what's happening to comprehension, performance, fatigue? The mismatch between the visual and the manual may be worse than just a reduction of the range. My hand tells me one thing, my visual system tells me another. Now, if we're talking total organism, then we have to realize that we look at the manual system almost as critically as we look at the visual system. In our day and age, where does she do her most work? Doing what? What's her occupation? Proofreading?
Editing.
Editing. What does that demand? Does it demand any hand-eye organization? What does the hand constantly tell her compared to this visual range? I see some reason for fatigue in the mismatch between the visual manual situations rather than just the mismatch in that range alone. Now let's
Range.
base in. That's recovery on 10. 8. What's the recovery on 11?
One more to the right on.
Pardon?
3. You're on 3.
4. All right. Okay. Fine today. Thank you. You know, some of the people who have questioned all of this are constantly quibbling over one or two prism diopters, and I have too. Maybe I didn't stop it fast enough. Maybe I stopped it too quick, and maybe I read it that way. I know that. But when I see the whole picture, even when it's only reduced a couple of prism diopters on each end, I have to pay attention to it. Is a plus quarter effective on some people? Is a plano white lens effective on some people as a plus lens? Have you ever played with that one a little bit? Why? Why? Magnification in a plano? What? Why? Come on.
Frame.
What?
Frame.
Frame out there. Is there any difference in light transmission in no lens and a white lens? What's the influence then of a plano lens? What does a plus lens do? If a plus lens acts as if something were moved farther away, right? And you can say it the other way around. That, as has been said, it relaxes accommodation. At least perceptually relaxes our interpretation of awareness. If it moves it out, how would I get less intensity from this light right here? How's the easiest way to get less intensity from this light? Just move away from it. Well, if a plano lens reduces intensity, I will interpret as if I'd moved away from it. So I pay attention to a couple of diopters of difference. Now this is far, but I want to make a point here. I still think recovery ranges are survival ranges. Do you understand why I use the word survival? How quickly can you recover from diplopia may be quite a critical survival function on a Los Angeles freeway. Or the confusion may not be diplopia, but the confusion that goes with the stress in the system that breaks down some of the synchrony that precedes diplopia. Let's look at near abductions, because they become even more significant to me as I look at this as we're playing with it. Now I want to go back to these if time permits, because I can look at these on the basis of efficiency. All right, now help me with this. Let's mark it out. What's the blur range on 16?
X.
Okay. What's the blur on 17?
I don't know.
What does that X say? Does that mean it's so good you don't have to pay attention to it? It's more than we need? Is that what an X says? When you don't get a blur finding, what does it mean? For discrimination, far more than there's so much that they're focusing already for it. Do we have any other evidence of that in the findings? What about our number 7? Did she have any latitude for discrimination on number 7? Almost neither. A quarter diopter interfered. A half diopter blurred her off the chart. That's not much latitude for discrimination. We're beginning to get closer to why I'm not too anxious to hang some plus on her all at once. All right. What is break on prism base out, number 16? 20. What is it on 17? 20 also? That's not bad, is it? What's recovery on 16? What? What's recovery on 17? What's this telling you? She's struggling to maintain some discrimination, which isn't too good, as we found in other findings. She manages to hold fusion, quote, quote, almost to be expected. But what happens then on a recovery basis when she tries to get back to what thing's about. Pretty fragile, isn't it? Any fatigue problem there? Any stress problem there? When you see that kind of a recovery range, and where is it? Outside of the plane of regard. Now what's a plus lens going to do to that recovery lens, which is already outside the plane of regard? What's it going to do? What does a plus lens do? Move it further out. What's it going to do to what she's got? Going to farther out of balance. The whole thing moves out now. The range all moves out. So I see this almost as significant as what a high exo would be. A low net.
Under fatigue?
Did you report it? More errors, more mistakes, more frustrations. And so I'm looking not at numbers. Numbers are just our way of putting it on paper. What I'm looking at is what is that total area of performance in which she can perform as she must as an editor. And when I see these kind of findings and these kind of frustrations, this is one of the reasons I have to back off a little bit on how quickly I hit her with plus lenses. Because plus lenses will influence recoveries faster than they influence forias. If you don't believe it, go play with it. If you've got low recoveries, start playing with plus and see what happens to those recoveries. It's the very first thing that will sag. They will sag much quicker than you get an increase in forias. Think your way through it optically. Think your way through it optically. What do you need for recovery? What do you need for recovery? Convergence. Recovery, yes. But what do you need optically? Where is it? That's the first thing. Why is it that when you've got a low recovery and the patient reaches out and touches it, now it's single again? They found out where it is, didn't they? Now, if they're tight in this situation and you don't get much freedom of plus as shown in our retinoscope, as shown in our subjective, as shown in our 14s and 15s, when you compare, take some nets out of there, the exos that go with the plus on 14s and 15s, then that plus can be pretty damaging. It can have too much impact for me. I want to gain some basic skill in, if you want to call it fusion, I don't care. I hate the word. Because we've grown up with fusion as the opposite of binocularity. Or as the opposite of diplopia, and the opposite of diplopia is binocularity. And it's a whole lot more than that. Binocularity has to be a whole lot more than just are both eyes pointed the same place at the same time. Right?
And looking at what's going on in this room,
I just think it makes me very, very proud to be here. We have spent probably a good hour on this point on how to help this patient, and yet we know that 9 out of 10 of the doctors who aren't in this room in our age group wouldn't have even given it a second of thought. They just wouldn't have prescribed anything. They wouldn't have even realized the patient had a problem. And so that even though we are kind of arguing amongst ourselves here and trying to decide what's best, at least we're trying to decide something. And however we did this, I'm sure with this patient and with proper follow-through, we'd be able to help her.
I appreciate that, and I would comment this. Among friends, it's called discussion. Only among enemies is it argument. And the important thing here, to me, is that we're probing ideas. We're thinking differently. Am I right? Have you been thinking differently this afternoon because of what we've been playing with? Well, now, another thing comes up, and it's terribly important. Dick, he needs, we'll get there in a minute. Terribly important. There's a thing called clinical judgment that you can't write in a book as hard and fast laws. And that's important. And that's why we're a profession instead of a trade. And the differences between us in this, probably, and you see, the differences between us today are very little. The differences between us are the significant differences when we're dealing with people as we deal with them. And Ron's point that it may be just communication is very much a part of it. Very much a part of it. Because I communicate with you with what's comfortable for me, not with what's comfortable.